Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Collar here, and returning to the show, CBS Sports Draft analyst Chris Trapasso. And not much has actually changed, but yet we did have an owners meeting since we last spoke, Chris. So we've got to get your latest update before we dive into everything that we've got planned for today's show of how you're feeling about where the Minnesota Vikings stand in their quest to potentially trade up to draft a quarterback. There seemed to be a feeling at the owners' meetings that the Vikings really want to do that. And I don't think Kevin O'Connell was all that shy about it every time he was asked. But there also are a lot of other teams, including Sean Payton, saying it's realistic to say that they would want to trade up. So even though we don't have a clear and obvious, hey, they're going to do this, it does seem like the chances are pretty high that somebody is able to move up to the top of the draft. So what do you think the Vikings' odds are of getting that done, trading up, and taking their guy?
Pretty high. I mean, to come out of the owners' meetings, like you mentioned, there was nothing definitive. But what is good for the Vikings is that there was nothing like the Cardinals GM, coming out and saying, "Hey, we're definitely going to pick a wide receiver," or "We're not going to move." Like all those teams from like 3, even the Patriots at 3, Cardinals at 4, were kind of like, "Yeah, our phone lines are open. Like we're ready." And I almost got the impression that everyone there, like, I mean, you mentioned Sean Payton saying like, "Yeah, it's realistic that the Broncos want to trade up," but it almost felt like everyone in attendance, and you were certainly there, so maybe tell me if this is wrong. It's like, why are we overthinking this? The Vikings have 2 first-round picks. They have the need. Like, they have more ammo in this draft than any other team. It just kind of felt like, to me, without even being there, just from gathering on Twitter, what everyone was saying, like, is it 3 or 4? No one really knows that, but it's probably going to be the Vikings. That doesn't mean that it's locked in. We don't have parameters of a deal or any report, but it just kind of feels like, stop overthinking it. The Vikings are the team that are most well-equipped to make that ascension up the board.
Well, the word that kept getting used, whether it was by Kevin O'Connell or Mark Wilf, owner of the Vikings, was flexibility. Kept saying, well, that pick gives us flexibility. And I think what it really gives them is the card in the back of their pocket to pull out and say, look, I know that you like first round draft picks and the Broncos are offering you 3, but we're offering them today. You can drive these draft picks off the lot today in this draft, and there's always more value to that. I think the big question still remains is, will the Vikings dip into 2025? There is a very good argument to not do that, especially if the Vikings have to play Sam Darnold and they end up, say, going 6-11 or something. And then you're talking about giving away a top 15 draft pick. I don't think that they want to do that. But also it's hard to project them as being a great team in the division for next year. And if you do have to develop a JJ McCarthy, that could happen. And so, there is I think some hesitation there, and that might be the sticking point. It also might be that Kevin O'Connell is going to spend the next several weeks meeting with these guys. And if you're going to go to your ownership and say, we're putting it all in, or you're going to your GM, you got to say, I am really sure I sat with this guy in a room. I did all the stuff working him out on the field, and I had lunch with him, and he ate the right foods, and he'd rather be a dog than a cat, and every other thing that they ask players when deciding whether to draft them or not. I think they might want to do that first, because I've been trying to put a timeline on when this is going to happen, and it could be any time from right after we're done with this podcast to right before the Vikings pick.
I think it's going to be, and you're usually right on Viking stuff, so maybe this is like jinxing it in a good way if people are impatient and want this to go down. I think, just as a draft analyst, it's going to happen like on the clock. And maybe there is some bias there that I'm in the Buffalo area, and that's what happened with the Bills, that Baker Mayfield goes off the board, Sam Darnold, and it's like, oh, is someone going to pick Josh Allen? Like, we got to get ahead of the Arizona Cardinals to do it, and they did, and they got the right Josh. The Cardinals had to settle for Josh Rosen. We just don't know, and we've talked about this quite a bit. Do the Vikings love J.J. McCarthy? How do they feel about Drake Maye? Are they like, do they kind of feel like those two are neck and neck? Are they like, oh man, if Drake Maye's there at 3 or 4, that's the guy that we need to get? Or are they like, hey, let's just get either one and we're totally at ease with that? And maybe, like, from what you just mentioned, they don't know that quite yet. They have all the evaluations done. Kwesi's, poured over all the analytics, but now it's time for Kevin O'Connell to meet with these guys and go, oh man, like Josh Rosen is kind of doesn't have his head on straight, and maybe he's not, in love with football the way Josh Allen is, or as hyper competitive as Josh Allen is, to use that 2018 example again. So I think, to me, it's unless they do just love one way more than the other, it kind of feels more likely that they'll say, okay, let's sit back and see what happens, and then we're ready to pull that trigger at pick 3 or pick 4 based on how those first couple picks unfold.
And it's really important to me that O'Connell sit in the room with whoever he's going to work with and try to simulate the experience of actually doing that, because that's how it's going to be. This is the most hands-on head coach with his quarterback probably in the entire National Football League. Mm-hmm. And he wants it that way. And I think if you're a quarterback, you like it that way too, because this isn't trying to hope and guess about the scheme. O'Connell is going to communicate that, and he's got to have someone who can reciprocate. I mean, I think with maybe someone like Will Levis, I don't know what it was they didn't believe in, but that is a possibility that when they had that chance to draft him, that they just thought he doesn't gel with the way that Kevin O'Connell wants to operate in some way, or he doesn't believe in the upside that we were all sold on. So they decided to pass, and they decided that this draft class had better fits for Kevin O'Connell. And whether that means best fit is at 3 or second best fit is at 4, but he's got to have, I think, multiple players here that he's going to be comfortable with, which really kind of takes us into the next phase of our discussion, which is I've invented a little bit of a game, because we are waiting to see, and it could happen at any time, the trade and what's going to happen if they are able to move up or if they stick and pick. But in the meantime, I've been reading a lot about this draft class. And something that I notice is that anytime you ever bring up a draftable quarterback, there is one person who says, that guy's going to be a bust. I don't believe in that guy. And they are very confident, and they make that declaration. I would never take that quarterback. If they do that, I will sell my season tickets and I will buy a cheese head. I see that every time. So what I thought was, let's talk about these criticisms of the quarterbacks and the quarterback class. And so what I did was I went through multiple different draft analysts who I will not name, but who are all credible. Put it that way. I didn't go to, draftdog.web. This is from all credible draft analysts, but I didn't want to say who, because I didn't want you to be in a position to have to argue with whatever other draft analyst. So these anonymous draft analysts, I'm going to read criticisms of theirs, of different quarterbacks, and I want you to tell me fact or fiction. Do you think it is an actual criticism of this quarterback, or is that something that is in the imagination of the draft analysts? So let us begin with, in my opinion, the best fit for the Minnesota Vikings, which would be Drake Maye. I think he's the best fit with his size, his ability, and his tool set to go with the Vikings and throw downfield to Justin Jefferson. But an unnamed draft analyst said of Drake Maye, quote, there are times when he just misses, which can be due to a lack of fundamentals, but sometimes he just misses throws of varying distances. Do you agree with that Drake Maye criticism?
I do. And we saw it at his pro day that I think early on there was a couple out routes that were just like, whoa, that was a high and away, like just a bit outside. But then I thought later in the pro day, once he kind of got those out of his system, he was hyper accurate. So yes, I do agree with that. I love Drake Maye. Just ever so slightly behind Caleb Williams in my scouting grade book, but that is true. Like, you will get those wild pitches every once in a while.
All right, now the addition to the game, which is to give me a 1 to 10 how much that matters for each criticism. How much does it matter that Drake Maye misses some passes in this way?
I don't think very much. That it's like, this kind of like might sound silly, but if a quarterback is going to throw, let's use that out route, for example. If he misses by a foot or by 5 feet, but otherwise like doesn't have an accuracy problem, it doesn't really bother me. Or if it's not even a high and away throw and it's a little bit behind the receiver and he has to adjust and he drops it and it's bad throw. Well, yes, one throw was technically more accurate than the other. The other one was 5 feet over his head out of bounds. but they're both incompletion. So to me, if it was a problem and you could watch all of Drake Maye's games and say, man, he's just not accurate with the football, then yes, you would point to those glaring negatives and say, yeah, here's the biggest example where any casual fan watching could see those misses. I don't really get that with Drake Maye, but and I remember it from Patrick Mahomes and I remember it from Josh Allen coming out. They had those, whoa, what was that throw? Like open wide receiver. And yes, you may get an occasional interception if that's an in-breaking route that, like the free safety is kind of waiting for that pass to be overthrown. But with Drake Maye, I would say at 1 to 10, it's about a 2 or a 3.
I think that when we watch so much of these guys, there's an expectation of perfection. We just think, oh, well, he's a first round pick. He should just be flawless. And then we forget then we forget what other guys looked like when they were coming out, or even what other guys look like on actual Sundays, because it's been a while since we've watched anybody on TV play National Football League football. And, Kirk Cousins was one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the NFL. He would miss throws sometimes too. That's not to dismiss that Maye does it more often than you would like. It's just that it's not going to happen with flawless precision every single time, especially when these guys are younger and have technical elements to their game that they clearly have to, improve on. So I also agree with this. And I think that it's more of a 3 or a 4 out of 10 for concern. If you do it all the time, it's a problem, but I don't think that that's how it is with Drake Maye. Next criticism of Drake Maye: can struggle to come off his pre-snap read when the picture changes on him post-snap. Is that a fair or unfair criticism of Drake Maye?
Unfair. I'll call that fiction, because I saw and we've talked about this, that the North Carolina offense, and then it's kind of funny that it's like all the offenses, they're kind of gimmicky. They're not pro style. And we've moved away from pro style being under center play action, but the down the field, like air raid, Washington offense, Oregon offense, North Carolina offense, like they scored a lot of points. And like there's NFL offensive coordinators that are moving from college to the NFL, like Ryan Grubb, and that are just incorporating a lot of those elements of just like, hey, like let's spread it out. Let's 4 verticals, and there's a tight end that runs a post down the middle and let it rip. So for being that in that offense, I went into Drake Maye, like having just watched him as a college football fan, as an analyst in December, watching him, and then early January, I was like, let's see if he's just like a one read guy. And I did not see that at all. I think he's, RPO slant, it's not there. I'm going to get to my second read. Do I think he's Drew Brees in his prime? No, but I would not call that a criticism. And I'm 99% sure I didn't have anything of, slow processor, get stuck on the first read in my own notes.
I would put it this way for me. I have had the privilege of covering 3 games, I think maybe 4, where Drew Brees played against the Minnesota Vikings. You mentioned Drew Brees. And he is the best at identifying everything, getting to read, setting his feet, being accurate, all those things. Just has this freakish Matrix-like ability to see the field with being 6 foot tall. It is one of the all-time godly type of abilities that I've ever seen. You know how many college quarterbacks I have been reminded of when watching them play of Drew Brees? 0. Absolutely none. Sure. Because it doesn't work that way. It's like just that the defenses are way less complicated. The quarterbacks are given far fewer options at the line of scrimmage. And when the picture changes, if there's a defense that's actually changing the picture at the line of scrimmage, it's got to be Alabama, because there aren't too many others that are coached like that, like Nick Saban did. Most of the time, the picture doesn't change. And I just think it's one of those, if you watch NFL all the time, then watch college football, you'd be like, these guys don't even go through their reads. And you're like, that's correct. They don't. That's why it's so hard to figure out who's going to be the next man up. So I won't rant too much about that more, but I just think that you could write that criticism for every single guy. Yeah. And there's nobody who today could step into the NFL and do it effectively.
And that's what I was getting at about the pro style offense kind of critique. Like, I think to write that in a scouting report today as a draft analyst, you would kind of get laughed at. Like, okay, dude, what's a pro style offense? But that criticism to me kind of reminds me of like trying to sneak in the didn't run a pro style offense in college criticism into a scouting report. Like, didn't get to his 5th read on every play. And it's like, Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen don't really do that either, and they get confused at times as well. So the Drew Brees example, and I think Kirk Cousins is good at, or has been good for his whole career at, understanding where to go with the football. If it looks like two safeties up top, but it's only one, but 99% of quarterback prospects are not good at that. There will be times where Drake Maye's confused, but I didn't see it as he could only get to the first read, and then he was like, oh, I'm going to run. Like, I saw him literally go across the entire field many times over the last 2 years and get through those progressions at North Carolina.
I also think just at the NFL level, it can be, and I'm not saying totally, but it can be a touch overstated. Like, it depends on the offense. It depends on how you play. And I believe, if I remember the stat from PFF, 70% of passes go to the first read. So it's just been one of those sort of cliche things that I was hoping you would say fiction, because that's what I think it is too.
Yeah.
So not real concerned about that, because I have no idea whether he'll be able to do it or not. And neither does anyone else. Last one for Drake Maye. We'll spend the most time on him for obvious reasons. He is let's see here, combination of traits and tape make him a boom or bust prospect. Is Drake Maye a boom or bust type of prospect?
So is that insinuating
fact
that
or fiction?
Tape?
You got to say fact or fiction.
Sorry, fiction. And I will say I don't really understand how that's written. And again, we're not trying to bash any draft analysts. A lot of times when I read other scouting reports, and I try not to do this in my own, you'll see like a positive, like a strength, and then in the negative section or the weaknesses, there's like the opposite thing. I'm like, well, which one is it? And to me, it's like, does that suggest that his tape is not that good, but he has really awesome traits? Or what is, I don't even know what that's suggesting, but I don't think, again, because of the back-to-back years where he was setting all these records as a sophomore at North Carolina, and then came back, didn't have as much NFL talent, and was still really good last year, getting through his reads, the arm talent, the improv, the running, the literally designed run game ability at his size. I don't think he's boom or bust. I think in general, he's relatively high floor because he checks a lot of the boxes of what you need out of a modern day franchise quarterback.
I will go with fact, because I think that applies to all of them. I think that any quarterback taken in the first round could have the ability to be great under the right circumstances, and they could all bust. And there have been,
who's the last quarterback? Sorry to kind of jump in here. Who's the last first rounder that's like, oh, he's kind of good. He's still on his same team that drafted him. They're maybe going to give him like a low level extension. Like, it just doesn't happen. It's either you get $250 million or you're on another team in like 2 or 3 years. So that is a good point, that it's really, they're all boomer bust technically.
Right. With teams moving on from the Kenny Pickett's and Justin Fields that are just kind of meh, it's really Daniel Jones that is the guy who fits into this category.
Yeah.
And the Giants now regret that. But he's the only one that you can really talk about who was not boom or bust. He was just kind of there. And is really likely to be a backup, I think, after this. All right, let's move on to Jaden Daniels. So it sounds to me anyway, like a lot of the critiques of Drake Maye just aren't really ones that would terrify you away from drafting him at the top if you're the Minnesota Vikes. Is that the bottom line? That's the point of the game, is to make that decision.
Yes, absolutely. Would not scare you enough. The 1 or 2 wayward misses every game or so. You just get to the next down. I've seen Josh Allen do it a bunch. Still, I've seen Patrick Mahomes do it a bunch. We're like, oh, that one skipped in the dirt. And then literally the next throw is in the bucket down the field 30 yards between 3 cornerbacks. And it's like, okay, that miss on the play before didn't matter. That's kind of how similar feeling that I get with Drake Maye. And that's the only critique that you mentioned that I do think is fact, but it just doesn't really move the needle that much.
Well, and for me, that's because there are NFL quarterbacks that way. And my comps for him have been Stafford and Eli Manning, and those guys had tons of bad throws. And, the high end is high. So let's move on to Jaden Daniels. Fact or fiction about this criticism from a credible draft analyst. Quote, mediocre velocity can sometimes struggle driving the ball into tight windows. How do we feel about that criticism? Fact or fiction on Jaden Daniels?
I'm going to say fiction. And I watched the LSU Pro Day in his throwing session, and I forgot which NFL Network commentators were talking over it, but it like they pointed out like, oh, and this is credible that like a lot of people that they've talked to in the league, and this is during Jaden Daniels' pro day, were concerned about his velocity. And I didn't see that on film. That's not to say that I think if you're ranking arm strength in 2024, once all these rookies are in the league, you would put him in the top 5 to 7 in football, because there are some freak arm talent guys at quarterback today. But he was one where, and again, there's some Josh Allen bias in watching Patrick Mahomes, where I think arm strength is vital today with how much zone coverage teams play, like 70%. Everyone's watching you, and without being these anticipation throwers, you need to maybe see the guy get open. Everyone's ready to converge on that throw, and you need to be able to throw it 60, 70 miles per hour in there in some occasions. I didn't come away from Jaden Daniels' film thinking, ooh, his arm just doesn't do it for me. And Bryce Young's arm did not do it for me. To me, I don't think Joe Burrow has a monster arm, and he's been able to get it done. I think Jaden Daniels is has plenty of arm talent. Although I will say on the meter, if we were doing this the other way, and I agreed with it, it is like an 8 or a 9 in terms of its importance. I just think that's fiction.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important things to reach a baseline and then be able to work with what you have, be very aware of what you have. So Nathan Peterman thought that he had a very strong arm. It turned out he didn't, and everyone just intercepted the passes.
He's a prime example.
Peterman threw.
He's a prime example that in Josh Allen's rookie year, which is so crazy to think that Nate Peterman started that season, that's what happened. Like, yes, there were a few interceptions that were on tips, but it was like, oh, we're just going to play zone, and we're going to look to see where he's going to go, and then we're going to just click and close on the football, and he just did not have anywhere close to the velocity needed to be able to make those throws. So it matters, and I think Jaden Daniels, like you're saying, is clearly at and above that baseline of how much arm strength a NFL starting caliber quarterback needs to have.
Yeah, if we were doing kind of tiers of it, I would put his in like the Jalen Hurts or a little above tier, because I never thought Jalen Hurts had an absolute cannon, but it's strong enough to get it into those windows, and also good enough to complete deep balls, get it 55 yards down the field to his receivers. So it matters, but I think that might be mistaken for some of the technical elements of throwing on time, where if you weren't maybe perfect base kind of thing, that some of the balls don't come out with the biggest velocity. So I think that it's like it's a little more fiction than fact, but it's like, we'll put it in a separate category of truth to all rumors, as a shout out to Stephon Diggs, that it's like, there's some shade of truth to it that he does not have a cannon. The next criticism is, will drop eyes in the pocket to scan for exits. So when there is things going on chaotic in the pocket, and this is a thing that if you do in the NFL, it will crush you. Yes. He brings his eyes away from the receivers, looking at the rush to try to find somewhere to escape. Is that fact or fiction on Jaden Daniels?
Completely fact. And that is, we've talked about it. That is one of my biggest concerns with him. And I do want to take this time to kind of say that I don't hate Jaden Daniels as a prospect. He's my number 5 overall player. I think in the right system or in the right situation, he can be that franchise-changing quarterback. But because his film is so good and there's all the production and the Heisman and throwing to Neighbors and Brian Thomas, it's just been better for us to talk about his weaknesses, because there aren't a lot, but they are a little scary. That is one of them. And you mentioned it, that can kill you in the NFL, and that normally when I'm watching a quarterback and we're all looking for that improv stuff. We were looking at it. Hey, can CJ Stroud do it enough? Is he athletic enough? I always look to see, do the eyes stay up when they leave the pocket? And I'm going to continue to repeat about Josh Allen, just because I've watched every single throw that he's made. For as good as Josh Allen is as a runner, he first keeps his eyes up. He's looking for that long ball where it's kind of a scramble drill. And he's hit so many of those in his career. Patrick Mahomes as well. Russell Wilson, Dak Prescott, Lamar Jackson, all very good at doing that. Jaden Daniels tends to drop the eyes and go, I'm out of here. Maybe he does get to his second read, but then he's gone. And I think he did pass up some opportunities to just flick it to Malik Neighbors or Brian Thomas. Ended up being a 50-yard run in the SEC. And the NFL, though, that's not going to be as sustainable and happen as regularly as it did, even against the Alabamas and the Georgias of the world.
I think it's more of when there's some chaos up front, like when someone's breaking through the line a little bit, that he brings it down. Like he's not escaping well looking to throw. And there's not a lot. I mean, there is some, but there's not a lot of those like, oh, I'm escaping, scrambling. And then there's the play down the field passing. It's either
No.
run or pass, which
Yes.
is exactly how, again, actually Jalen Hurts plays the same way. You don't see Jalen Hurts doing the Russell Wilson where it's like scramble, 40-yard pass. You don't see, and
No.
Allen does that. Mahomes does it. You don't see that same. I think that it's like a 7 or an 8 as far as.
Oh, it's important.
It's a very scary thing. Yeah.
It is.
All right. Next one. Last one for Jaden Daniels. His frame translates to a dire lack of play strength working through tackles as a creator. So a lack of play strength because of his frame. Agree with that?
I'm going to say mostly fiction. I mean, you're not really hoping and wanting your quarterback to be a big tackle breaker anyway. And you've probably looked up if there's any PFF study that's been done on this, but I've read things in the past, and it's just from watching, like anecdotally, I would say this. I think we need like the next push that we need to get from the draft Twitter and NFL analytics Twitter to get into mainstream. And there's been a lot of things like labeling guys just edges, not 3-4 outside linebackers. That was a big thing like 10 years ago. It's so cool that that's like mainstream today, like on broadcast. Most of the injuries at quarterback happen when a quarterback gets hit inside the pocket. There's no, he runs, he's going to get injured. Like, that's just not really what happens. Now, maybe you totally feel different, but like watching the Jimmy Garoppolos and the Kirk Cousins and the Daniel Jones and the Carson Wentz, those are guys that can't, Tua Tagovailoa didn't get hurt last year, but would usually get hurt inside the pocket. So there's not, for me, like his size, 6'3", 210, he can add 10 to 15 pounds easily to that frame. He's kind of spindly and not lose any of that explosion. I don't think like I'm worried about his lack of play strength to break tackles. He's a very good creator, of course, because of how bendy and fluid and athletic he is, explosive he is when he's running with the football.
There is a legitimate concern about Jaden Daniels injuring himself by the way that he plays with a reckless nature. And I think that the injury prone is entirely up to the guy. I mean, do you hold on to the ball too long and take bad hits? Do you take risks when you're out there running? Somebody who does and doesn't get hurt a lot is Josh Allen. He does take some risks in not going down, but Josh Allen is like 240 pounds. So he's got that Ben Roethlisberger layer of extra padding that he could take on. And Dante Culpepper the same way. Those guys could take on linebackers. Jaden Daniels is not taking on a linebacker. So, okay, that's not going to happen. But he's going to escape with his quickness. He's lightning quick. He's going to use that. And he's not going to run through people. And if he does, then what's going to happen is the same stuff that happened to him in college sometimes where he got really popped. And so I think that it's like mostly fiction, but also there's another part of his game that is a fact to it. Like if he plays reckless, he will get hurt because he is not 240 pounds. So I think if that's the point of the critique, then there is truth to that.
Yes, I agree. And that's why I said mostly fiction, because what you just pointed out, and it's from my previous point about that most quarterbacks get injured inside the pocket. It's so last year, Tua Tagovailoa in the offseason, he reportedly gained some weight because he's like, I want to be able to absorb hits. Now, he happened to stay healthy and great for him. But to me, I think long term, if you're a quarterback, you want to try to be able to do everything you can to avoid getting hit, as opposed to I'm just going to beef up and just take these shots from blitzing linebackers. Like, I wouldn't even want to get hit from Ivan Pace, who's like one of the smallest linebackers in the NFL. He's so stocky. So, yes, you're right that Jaden Daniels probably will take some big licks in the NFL, and the team that drafts him probably scared about that. But he's also going to avoid like 100 hits that a Tua or a Mac Jones would have absorbed either in the pocket or as they're escaping. So it's mostly fiction, but there is some truth to it.
Right. And like Lamar got hurt one year and then was healthy last year. And Jalen Hurts was healthy and he's about as strong as anybody in the NFL. That guy is a rock. And then he got hurt last year and it really took apart his game when he couldn't move. So, I mean, I think with football in general, and I also apply this a little bit to Michael Penix's takes, Like, people get hurt in football. There is no player who ever comes out of their career at any position except for maybe kicker, punter, or long snapper and says, no, it was great. It was fine. I had no problems. No surgeries. Just
No
everything
bumps
worked
and
out
bruises.
fine. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know what you guys are talking about, this physical sport of football. So anyway, let's move on to JJ McCarthy. Some interesting ones here from McCarthy, starting with, quote, he fails to stand out in many of the areas that tend to be predictive of top level success in the NFL. This is a broad criticism. Is it fact or fiction that McCarthy, quote, fails to stand out in many of the areas that tend to be predictive of success at the top level in the NFL?
Well, of course, the first thing that pops into my head is like, what are those things apparently? Is it accuracy? Is it arm strength? I would say with this one, it's mostly true in that because of two words, stand out. I wouldn't say, wow, he's really accurate. He stands out. Now, does that mean stand out in the game that he's playing in against Indiana or Wisconsin or Northwestern? Yes. Is it standout traits compared to Drake Maye or Jaden Daniels or Caleb Williams? I would say no. So I think in general that is mostly true. Well, I mean, how important it is, it's so general, it's kind of hard to say because I do think he does meet, like you mentioned with arm strength, a lot of the baselines that you want. So I would put it right in the middle, like 5 or 6 in terms of importance that you would like to have the freak, the Justin Herbert type, the Josh Allen type. But JJ McCarthy at least meets those standards, but standout, I don't think he does that.
Yeah, I think that this one is very true. And it's kind of the reason of my skepticism is that there isn't one tool you can look at and say, oh my gosh, watch this man throw that football, or watch him run. Look how fast he is, or whatever like that. And when it comes to leadership, mentality, how much information you can handle and regurgitate out on the football field, those are things that might be his freak skill, but we don't actually know that because I didn't coach him and you didn't coach him. So that's Kevin O'Connell's job to figure out if that's actually his top skill. And I think that this sounds like maybe the harshest of criticisms that we're going to have for anybody, even, and then we're saying it's true. But I also think that there are other quarterbacks in the NFL where you would not say, wow, they have this one thing that blows your absolute mind, but they execute their offense effectively. And you're also thinking about developing some of the raw elements to where it does look more like that. And I think of his arm strength that way. Like, he clearly throws the ball super hard, but you're going to have to harness that a little bit more. And he's clearly very quick with his feet. But when do you take off? Are you going to make a difference at times in the NFL? You can when they play man coverage and vacate the middle of the field. So are you going to ID that? I don't know if he is or not. Going to be able to do those things. So I think that there's areas where he can develop to be above average. If you have a quarterback that has 5 or 6 areas where they're above average versus maybe one monster tool, that might be just as good. But I think that is the one thing that holds me back from saying, oh yeah, give up the farm for this player.
Yeah, that last point, like, you need to clip that and just keep that on social media, maybe pin it at the top of your profile on Twitter, because that is the book on JJ McCarthy. That it's, do you lean for the Justin Herbert, the Lamar Jackson, the Jaden Daniels that have, like, anyone, a 10-year-old could watch and go, that guy's really fast. That guy has a really strong arm. JJ McCarthy just kind of checks lightly all of those boxes that you want. Good enough arm, accuracy's good, improvisation's good, a lot of experience, made some big throws in some key games, was never really the guy. That's really the biggest dilemma, and I think why everyone is so torn and there's so much polarizing opinion on JJ McCarthy, because we've leaned into, even I have, find the freak, find the guy that can, that's huge, that's really fast, has a big arm, when JJ McCarthy might just be like a 7 across the board. And I think that can still be productive in today's NFL.
All right, we are back to analyzing quarterbacks' processing, which again, I think is very, very difficult to do. And I am always a little bit on the hesitant side to say that, unless someone looks totally lost at the line of scrimmage. But on JJ McCarthy, a credible draft analyst wrote, quote, below average processing and timing on anything except for his first read. Is that something that you took note of with JJ McCarthy at Michigan, or is that fiction?
Mostly fiction. I think he is probably, again, he's not stand out in that regard, that I wouldn't put him at number 1, but I wouldn't necessarily put him at number 6 if we're talking about 6 quarterbacks here as kind of, first round caliber. That I saw him read the entire field. Now, is he doing it on every single drive at Michigan? No, because sometimes he threw the ball like 2 times on a drive, and you're like, oh, you didn't really get to see much from J.J. McCarthy there, but they scored a touchdown with 10 runs and 2 passes. And yeah, processing, for as much as I may, of course, like mention the football IQ, like if a guy's making bad decisions over and over again, or hitting his check down quickly, I'll make note of that. But I try to lean away from like processing, because we're not inside his helmet. We can't see, like, he's like, oh, I'm peeking over here, but I need to go here in a second. I don't think it's a huge problem. And actually, like now, even in my head, kind of going through the film from JJ McCarthy, there are a bunch of throws where it was, oh, he kind of read that safety drifted toward the sideline. So now that post is open and made some anticipation throws. So I think, again, not standout, but the anticipation or the processing for him is fine. So I'll say mostly fiction there. And that, of course, is very important. It's just so hard to kind of pin down.
I think that this one, I would try to judge on, does the guy do unexplainable stuff? That's the only thing. Like, I can see, and I'll tell you, 2 guys who were top draft picks who did unexplainable stuff and did not work out, Jameis Winston and Sam Darnold. And Sam Darnold still does when he plays. Unexplainable. I have no idea what you saw, why you threw that football, how you came to that conclusion, because your brain clearly just doesn't work fast enough to be able to understand where you're supposed to put the football. And I don't see that with JJ McCarthy. I just see a lack of precision. That's my thing with McCarthy, more than it is where he was throwing the football. Cause I never thought, oh my God, dude, what? Like, I didn't think that a lot in JJ McCarthy's tape, maybe a couple times in the Maryland game, but aside from that, not as much. And I also think, look, here's an offshoot question that I think is very interesting about JJ McCarthy. Would you, if you could draft Jimmy Garoppolo and put him on the Minnesota Vikings, what Jimmy Garoppolo was at his best? I think he's banged up. He's not that good anymore, but just was the best version of Jimmy Garoppolo. Would you put that on the Vikings if you could draft it 4th overall? Would you do that?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm not, I mean, again, I've been leaning toward the bigger freakish athletes. That's not Jimmy Garoppolo. But like leaving New England, going to San Francisco the first couple of years, I mean, he was in a Super Bowl. He was in another NFC title game. And it wasn't like, oh, like the 49ers are winning in spite of Jimmy G every game. Like, I'm sure there were some games where he had modest stat lines. But when he was really at his best, like making smart decisions, being pretty accurate, but not like freaky athletic, not really having a standout trait, he was pretty good.
I think a lot of fans would say no, that they don't want him. I would totally disagree with that. I would say 100%. And McCarthy's faster than Jimmy Garoppolo.
Bigger,
but I think there's similarities though between the 2 guys. But if you could draft that guy on his rookie contract, and there were times where he did stick too long on a read, or he was inaccurate and not perfectly sharp, but he got the ball out to his playmakers on a stacked team, you can win a lot of football games with that. It's not the absolute ideal of getting Patrick Mahomes, but it can put you in position to be great. And so I'm always interested in that, because the other night there were people who were saying on my live stream, like, well, we'd rather have, Bo Nix than Kyler Murray. And it was like, wait. No, I think you'd rather, like, this just tells you the hype of quarterbacks in the draft and where the standards get pumped up too, that even like someone like Jimmy Garoppolo, I think would be a thumbs down if that's what McCarthy became. But I think that might be the best like comparison of what he can become.
Yeah. And I think recency bias is a hell of a drug, and it's real. So you're like thinking Jimmy Garoppolo, Kyler Murray, but like in their primes, like young, healthy, not banged up, operating at their highest processing, let's say, yes, you would take Kyler Murray on this Vikings team. You would take, I think, Jimmy Garoppolo. But for as much as I think I get what you're saying about like production wise, JJ McCarthy and Jimmy G, like stylistically, are not crazy similar in my opinion. You get more obviously improvisation with JJ McCarthy, but yes, there are similarities between the two. And at number 4, again, in this, what I kind of have started to call like an insulated environment, you have to think that the Vikings could get, with everything that they have, all the different reasons why they could get the most out of a quarterback, you would be fine with JJ McCarthy.
If you told me that the Commanders were picking him, I would go, I don't
For
know,
sure. Totally
guys. Like,
different.
I don't, but this situation is just different. It just is. All right. So Bo Nix and Michael Penix will go through a little quicker because we have our bust comps, a yearly tradition where we give
Woo-hoo.
our comparisons for the quarterbacks to if they're going to bust, they will be like player X. I absolutely love some of mine, so I can't wait to get to that. But with Bo Nix, the criticism here from Factor Fiction: inconsistent toughness in the pocket, shows good flashes, but too often falls away from throws. Is that fact or fiction of Bo Nix?
So the beginning of that, I was going to say fiction, but there are times like he's kind of like a fadeaway thrower. And what's ironic is we saw like Drake Maye do that at his pro day to kind of show these like what like one leg like Dirk Nowitzki type throws is still to show, I think, how strong his arm is. But the end of that, I would say mostly true. I think he's strong in the pocket. Like I was never questioning his toughness or his athleticism or his ability to take a hit. But there are a few times where Bo Nix, and maybe more than everyone else in this class, probably more than everyone else, kind of does that, like kind of fades away and maybe trusts his arm a little bit too much to not take that hit. If he has Justin Herbert's arm or even Drake Maye's arm, it doesn't really matter, but he doesn't have that capability to really crank the RPMs when fading away, which is, most offensive coordinators are not going to be happy when they're young quarterbacks doing that in a game.
And I think a few of his throws that are really fun on college tape are picked off for pick sixes 98 times out of 100.
When they're not in
Basically,
the Pac-12.
right, if the safety catches it, he's going all the way. Because there are these like, well, he's rolling this way and he kind of does a jump fade or whatever. Kind of like when your video game doesn't really react right to how you're pushing the button, or you hold it down too long and the guy just turns. Or if you push the wrong button, you mean to throw someone in front of you and you throw across. So he turns and just whips it like a crazy person. Like that's kind of what Bo Nix does sometimes, and he has to not do that. I think that is a legitimate criticism, as well as, and we'll move to Penix quick. I thought this one was as well. Doesn't have elite drive velocity when he pushes passes into the deep third. Yep, that's true. And I think both of these things are probably pretty big criticisms that are deserved. Now on to Penix.
Okay.
The fastest quarterback in the league, Michael Penix, after he ran his 40 and ran somewhere between 4.5 and 4.6. A really good pro day for him to show that he is an athlete. And sometimes a guy uses his athleticism more in the NFL, and sometimes pocket quarterbacks are good athletes. They just don't know how to use it. So I think that's probably the latter with Penix. But that's my commentary. Here's an expert who said, quote, he is a one-speed thrower, can only throw line drives, struggles to add arc and touch to the football. Fact or fiction on Michael Penix, one-speed thrower?
Mostly fiction. I think there's just so many fastballs that needed to be fastballs because he threw like a million passes the last 2 years at Washington. You get through a few games and you're like, man, it felt like most of his throws were fastballs, but the amount of downfield long balls that he threw to Odunze and Jalen Polk and Jalen McMillan, I don't remember coming away thinking, man, he doesn't have touch. Now, I did come out of his film thinking he wasn't quite as accurate as it felt like he was just watching him during the season as a fan. I was like, oh, there were a couple misses. And maybe at times you're like, oh, maybe that could have been feathered in there a little softer. But I don't think he has the inability to drop it in the bucket down the field, that it's always just going to hit the side of the bucket. So I think that's mostly fiction, but he's not the greatest touch thrower that I've ever scouted.
Yeah, I think that if you were running an offense that ran a lot of slants over the middle of the field, that you wouldn't necessarily like him because I don't think he has that flawless sort of touch and leading guys on those underneath routes, slants, stuff like that. Now, that's not what the Vikings do a whole heck of a lot. They like the more downfield stuff. But when you'd have somebody coming out of a double move, and he would have to throw with anticipation and guide that ball over the
corner. Yeah.
I saw a lot of that. I saw a lot of touch. It was like the farther he threw down the field, the more touch there was with his ball. But there were times definitely where I thought, all right, that's a simple comeback route and you do need to drive the ball, but he would throw it so hard it would go too high or something like that. And I mean, that's like, to me, getting far into the weeds of someone who is fantastic at throwing the football. So I'm going to
Yeah.
go, all of Penix's concerns are not regarding throwing the football. For
Yeah,
me, it's just,
seriously.
the other stuff. So let's wrap the show on a
Okay.
yearly tradition. Every year, because everybody, when they do comps, they compare them to, and I've done this year, hey, Jaden Daniels is Randall Cunningham and Drake Maye is Matthew Stafford or Eli Manning. Well, let's go the opposite. Instead of saying they're going to be nothing but wonderful, what if they don't work out? And then what does that reveal to us about these prospects? So let us begin with Caleb Williams. What is your bust comparison for Caleb Williams?
This one, when I wrote this, so I did this article for CBS Sports last week after we kind of teased it in last week's episode. When I wrote it initially, I was like, oh, this is kind of far-fetched, but it's actually, I think, spot on. Johnny Manziel. I think it has to be Johnny Manziel. Now, do I think that Caleb Williams is going to never open his iPad with his playbook and be partying during the week? I don't think that, but we've talked about this off air that I think the one maybe concern is not that he doesn't care like Johnny Manziel seemingly didn't and just wants to be a superstar, but maybe some of let's just categorize it as off-field character stuff with not being happy with the situation, whatever. And just their play styles are very similar. Now, Johnny Manziel was not as physically gifted as a thrower, but in terms of running around and reversing his field 9 times in the SEC and terrorizing the SEC, Johnny Manziel did a lot of really awesome stuff at a high level in college football. So I think it's got to be Johnny Manziel for me for the bust comp for Caleb Williams.
I thought of the same one, and I figured that you were going to think of that. So I tried to go a different direction because it is very good. Because look, if you can't handle some of the heat of playing in the NFL and you don't have the dedication, which I don't know. I mean, we're going to find out because everybody says they do going in and then we see, but the scrambling around that looks so much fun in college football does not always translate. It translates for one guy, and that is Patrick Mahomes. And I don't know how many other guys that really has ever worked for. So I think that's right. But I was trying to, Jamarcus Russell is such a cliche that to bring up. It's just oh, he's the next Jamarcus Russell or something. The way in which he'd be similar to Jamarcus Russell is the hype, is that it's just, if he were to go bust, it would be on the same level. And I'm not saying for the same reasons. It would be on the same level of this guy is untouchable, has unbelievable generational tools, and then it just didn't work out. So I thought of that. It's almost too cliche to compare people to Jamarcus Russell. So I also thought of Sam Darnold at USC, where the physical ability is so impressive. The hype is so high. The arm talent is so high. And it was really the mistakes that defined Sam Darnold. And I thought last year, Caleb Williams had a lot of mistakes as well, especially when pressure ramped up. He was one of the lowest graded quarterbacks by PFF under pressure. And that's how Sam Darnold is. Under pressure, he kind of freaks out and does crazy stuff. And I thought the same thing with Caleb Williams. So that's my bust comp for him. How about Drake Maye? Mine might be a tad controversial with Drake Maye of whether this guy is actually a bust or not. But I'll let you go first with Drake Maye.
With Drake Maye, which, by the way, those for Caleb Williams, to mention the hype, I think is a little different of how I approach this. I was kind of looking more stylistically, but those are good. Jamarcus Russell and Sam Darnold, because the hype was through the roof for both of those players. And yes, if Caleb Williams is just bad with the Bears and is just on a different team, it will be, you'll see top 20 NFL bust in history. That will be up, he'll be close to Jamarcus Russell at the top. For Drake Maye, I'm going with Blake Bortles from UCF. That similar body types, bigger. Blake Bortles kind of had a weird delivery coming out of UCF, but was pretty athletic. He was used he was part of that, RPO, zone read, when that was kind of the trendy kind of offensive philosophy coming from college to the NFL. Ran the football a lot, big body, and then had the one season where he threw 35 touchdowns and had a bunch of interceptions that year too. Gets very close to being in a Super Bowl, which is insane to think of, that we almost had a Nick Foles, Blake Bortles Super Bowl that year. And then ultimately it was oh yeah, he's kind of not really that good at all. And he was kind of buoyed by the defense in Jacksonville. Not a colossal, next to Jamarcus Russell type bust, but he was the 3rd overall pick in the 2014 draft. So Drake Maye, he's probably going to get picked right there as well. stylistically, college careers, the size, I just felt I had to go with Blake Bortles for Drake Maye.
Yeah, I like that. The size for sure. And like the raw talent of Blake Bortles, the guy could have been a star, but
Yeah.
it just did not work out. And with Drake Maye, though, I'll say this is a tad controversial. Jay Cutler is my bust comparison. And Jay Cutler became a very highly paid franchise-ish quarterback for the Chicago Bears. Never had a lot of success really with Chicago, and Denver was done with him personality-wise, probably more than anything. But Denver was done with him for a couple years. He did not have a winning season with Denver. If you take someone as a first-round draft pick and they are so reckless and wild with the football that you're moving on after a couple years. And this is not to say anything of Drake Maye's personality. It's really about how he plays, because Jay Cutler had one of the ultimate arms in the NFL. When it was at his best, it was unbelievable. But he also, we talked earlier about those wild throws, and we mostly said, well, I don't know if it's that huge of a concern, but if you don't ever get rid of it, then it is at times. And that's, I think, whether it's a true bust or not, probably not for Jay Cutler, but still like a 500 type quarterback. That's not what you're hoping for when you draft someone at the top. So that's what I'm going for with Drake Maye.
Yeah, that's a good one, just because of the kind of erratic tendencies that kind of grew from Jay Cutler throughout his career. And if they are a slight problem early with Drake Maye, and then suddenly it's like, oh man, there was like 3 or 4 in that game, and one was picked off in crunch time, then yes, I could certainly see that. That's a good one.
All right, for Jaden Daniels, I'll just give you mine. I'm not as proud of it. It's just harder with runners because history doesn't have a lot of drafted runners, and a lot of them that were drafted actually were great. So I went with Marcus Mariota. Is that lazy? Is that too simple?
No, I think that's pretty good. I think with him, he kind of never felt like I would kind of compare him to EJ Manuel, that they never were like assertive enough. They always, and that's not saying like rah-rah, like in their teammates' face on the sideline, but just as throwers, as runners, like you look at EJ Manuel and it was like 6'5", 235, tested very well. Marcus Mariota tested through the roof, ran all over the field in the Pac-12, but it was like in the NFL, he was just never really taking risks. And never really leaned on his legs. EJ Manuel was the same way. He was part of that zone read trend as well, and like would never take the ball. Like he never wanted to have the ball in his hands. I think athletically, because Marcus Mariota was really, really talented as a runner, and we thought he was going to be like the next RG3, never really materialized. I think that's a good one for Jaden Daniels too.
Yeah, I just think that the worst element of Jaden Daniels being the sacks, I think that was a problem with Mariota, not necessarily keeping your eyes downfield. And if you can't just dominate people with your receivers and with your legs in the same way that you do in college, do you have another answer? And the big stats. Like that was another thing too, that Mariota had these incredible stats. Daniels did that last year. So it's not my favorite one, but I think it works. Who did you have?
So I kind of already called it out. It's RG3. I think size, speed, taking big shots in the open field. That RG3's injury avalanche kind of started. He got hit by Haloti Ngata at home against the Ravens late in his rookie season, and like kind of his knee kind of snapped forward, like overextended. And then obviously they just kind of compounded after that, where he was just taking too many big hits. I think the FedEx Field turf didn't really help him necessarily. Great downfield thrower at college, or in college, throwing to Kendall Wright, who was a first-round pick. Josh Gordon was there for a year. It was like, man, he can just drop it in the bucket all day. We will find out how good of a downfield thrower Jaden Daniels is, because he's not going to throw to guys that have Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas type advantages over their cornerbacks that are covering them in the NFL, most likely. I mean, I said that about Tua, and then he gets Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. But I just think size, length, speed, like there's that famous zone read that RG3 ran like an 80-yard touchdown late in the season for Washington that kind of propelled them into the playoffs. I could see Jaden Daniels having one of those runs as a rookie too. We're like, oh man. And like, you remember at that time, it was like RG3 was the biggest rock, like more than Tom Brady. It felt like he was like the biggest rock star in the league. Like this guy's revolutionizing the sport more than Michael Vick did, because he's a great thrower. And then it just never really happened because the spatial awareness that we've talked about in this episode and others, Jane Daniels like doesn't really have it, similar to how RG3 didn't have it, and he took way too many hits, and I think it shattered his confidence.
Oh, I definitely think so. And when the explosiveness wasn't the same, he wasn't the same. But
No.
I think even EJ Manuel, when he had that knee injury, his confidence went down as well. But yeah, I think that's the most clear cut, because if he works out, he could be the best version of what RG3 could have become. All right, for McCarthy, this is my favorite one. This is one I worked hard on.
For this.
I put a lot of effort into, because one of the things that's hard to find is guys who are drafted this high that don't have that one special skill. It is actually really hard, or big stats. It's really hard to find that. So I went back and I scrolled and I hunted and I discovered a winner at a very successful university with a NFL caliber head coach, early 2000s. Can you guess where I'm going? Doesn't have a huge skill and is drafted in the top 5.
Early 2000s. Like, are we going like closer to actually the year 2000, or like
closer to the year 2000?
Yeah. I'm gonna I mean, this is probably not right, but the one that pops out to me, Joey Harrington.
That's a good try. It is Mark Sanchez.
Ooh.
The Sanchez. Yep.
Okay.
And I think if he goes bust, it's going to be because he doesn't have a cheat code, which Mark Sanchez never really had either. Mm-hmm. And the whole thing was like, well, he's, NFL head on his shoulders and that sort of thing, but he never had athleticism that totally wowed you, arm strength that totally wowed you, and the whole processing, how does he run an offense, all that stuff. It never really came to fruition. It did at times, and he had his moments. He wasn't a horrendous NFL quarterback, but he just never got over that hump, and maybe circumstance played into it. Rex Ryan wanted to run the football and all that sort of stuff, protect the ball. But I think if it doesn't go right for JJ McCarthy, it will look something like that.
And there's a funny story that I have that's like embedded in my brain forever. When Mark Sanchez, he did not have the big stats, and he was a redshirt sophomore when he came out in that 2008 or 2009 draft, that they interviewed Pete Carroll, and you're expecting every coach at the time to say, oh, he's great. If you can still find that on YouTube, Pete Carroll like came out and was like, I think he left too early. He's not ready for, like, literally to assembled media. And it was like, oh my, and maybe at the time everyone's like, oh, what does he say? He's just mad that he's not getting his star quarterback back. But then right as Mark Sanchez was like, oh, he's not really the guy, it was like, instead of just Jim Harbaugh saying, oh, I think JJ McCarthy is the best quarterback in this class, Pete Carroll literally at USC at the time as the head coach said the opposite about Mark Sanchez and was like, he should have stayed, which that I'll never forget. That I thought that was like incredible that a head coach of a major program said that. I like that comparison a lot, because like we talked about earlier, we said it was fact that JJ McCarthy does not have that standout wow trait. And usually the guys we always talk about in the first round, corners, wide receivers, edge rushers, like those are the freaks that were pretty good in college. Round 2, guys aren't quite as athletic, but they were really good in college. So usually when you're that high, it's the same for quarterbacks. You have something that stand out, and JJ McCarthy doesn't necessarily have that.
And you mentioned the stats. I didn't even remember to bring that up, but that was a big part of my comp. When I was looking back, I was like, what were Mark Sanchez's college stats? It's like, oh, he won a lot of football games, but they didn't actually have big numbers from him, similar to with McCarthy. And it was all about, well, what he can be, what he's going to grow into, and maybe a cautionary tale, or maybe it won't ultimately end up meaning anything. Who did you have for McCarthy?
All right, yours, I mean, that one is really good, and that was a name that kind of escaped me. So yours is better than mine, but I'm going with Christian Ponder. Now, Christian Ponder kind of had the opposite. He had the
you can't do that on this show. You can't go with Christian Ponder on this show. You're going to terrify people.
I have to, because I think, to kind of segue from that Pete Carroll story, that Jimbo Fisher was like, oh, he's just so smart. He's such a great leader. And that was in the era of the pro style offense. And it was, he, can be under center. He can do play action, I formation, very smart with the football, great leader. He kind of like on the surface checked all the boxes. And then during that draft process, I remember it like, hey, this guy could go relatively early, because offensive coordinators are going to love him. And everything that we gathered from the combine was, oh yeah, like the league is so much higher on JJ McCarthy than maybe the media is, because when you meet him, he's just so smart. He had the, NFL caliber head coach in Jim Harbaugh kind of teaching him. Christian Ponder was a multi-year starter, just like JJ McCarthy. I think the athleticism was somewhat similar, that Christian Ponder, look at his combine, was very good coming out, and did make some plays outside of the pocket at Florida State, but never really leaned on it, kind of like Marcus Mariota in the NFL. And maybe there's a world where JJ McCarthy tries it in week 1 and gets smacked by a 270-pound edge rusher who runs a 4.5 and is like, oh, I'm not going to really try that anymore. That's kind of what happened. I mean, you probably know, and your fans know more about the intricacies of why it didn't work for Christian Ponder. But from afar, as an analyst, those are the things that I remember why Christian Ponder was so well liked and went inside the top 15, and then ultimately why it didn't work out for him in the NFL.
Yeah, I think when you're selling on, hey, this guy's a winner, hey, this guy,
big program,
to just run your offense, big program. Like, I don't know, Ben Roethlisberger went to Miami, Ohio. So like, it's just Patrick Mahomes went to Texas Tech, like these Wyoming for Josh Allen. Like that doesn't always mean a whole heck of a lot. And honestly, the quarterbacks from the bigger universities, just thinking off the top of my head, have not always been very successful. I mean, even recently, Mac Jones, not too successful coming from Alabama. Of course, CJ Stroud from Ohio State, but there was that Ohio State thing. Like, oh,
forever.
Well, right. Exactly. So, but anyway, I think that's a solid comp, even though it's the last one. I'm glad that we buried it late in the show. Hopefully
Sorry,
everyone
guys.
shut it off first before you made it, but I can see what you're talking about. And sometimes it's all about how it turns out. If you take Christian Ponder and you put him in the circumstances the Vikings have now, does he turn out more confident? And a lot of it is confidence, belief. Can you really be that guy? And if you get smacked in the mouth early, that can hurt. For Bo Nix, I went into my bag here and I got Brian Brom because he really only had one great year in college. And because when he was in college, there was a lot of discussion about, hey, this Brian Brom guy, he's like really taking this big step forward at Louisville. He's going to be a top draft pick. And then he was like a second rounder and he never did a thing. So that could be the case for Bo Nix. If he's a bust, he's probably a second rounder and he just never does a thing.
Yeah, that's the one that for Bo Nix that I had too. And that I remember there being like, could Brian Brom be like a top 10 pick in that draft class? And it was like, oh, maybe not. And I think on the field, they kind of like were similar, that Brian Brom had a lot of downfield strikes, that those Louisville teams were really good when he was there. Surprisingly, it was like, oh, Louisville's like on the map as a college football program again. So I think that's a really good one. That's the one that I was leaning toward. Wasn't he ultimately like a second round pick? Right.
Yeah. That was part of my thought process. Actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Early on in the process, and I'm not going to say that I totally remember the Brian Brom pre-draft process, but I do remember there being he could be a first rounder. Maybe he's going to eventually be the best quarterback in this class. And then as the draft approached, it kind of fizzled out. I could see that. I mean, all it would take would be for the Broncos to pick him at 12, and that's not the case. But I really think that it's most realistic that it fizzles out similarly to Brian Brom. And it's, oh yeah, he's like one of the first 5 or 6 picks in the second round, and we'll see where he kind of goes from there.
And with Michael Penix, I went back and forth between two guys. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they played for the same university. I was trying to decide between Brandon Weeden and Mason Rudolph. Because, I mean, there was discussion with Mason Rudolph of, oh, this guy could be a first-round pick. There were some people that really liked him. Look at the numbers he put up. It's crazy. He put up all these numbers, and he's got this big arm. And then he was picked in the third round. He's been a career backup. I could see that for Michael Penix. I really could. I think that he's better than that. I think that he's a lot better than that. That's from me watching and me just thinking about these guys. But also we were talking about credible draft analysts. There were credible draft analysts who thought, yeah, Mason Rudolph should be a first round pick. And he wasn't. So, but his numbers, his size, his arm strength, they were all checking boxes, but he had no playmaking element. And no matter how fast Penix runs as a 40, I'm still going to question whether he can actually make plays, because those are two very different things.
All right, so mine is not technically a bust, but when I look back at him and think in my head, I still kind of view him as a bust relative to the hype and where he was picked. And this is another Vikings one. How about Sam Bradford? And I feel like you've kind of compared Penix to Bradford just overall, like for real comparison, which I think is still a very good one. But in that draft class, I'll never forget this too, that Todd McShay on ESPN at the time was like, he has the highest grade I've ever given a quarterback. The accuracy is through the roof. He throws with a lot of velocity. He's aggressive. He's assertive. He'll take a hit and just get back up and make another throw. Now, he was a little bit frail in college. Michael Penix dealt with a bunch of injuries early in his college career and was kind of damaged, or kind of is damaged goods, I guess. I mean, he ultimately passed these physicals, but to have torn ACLs and shoulders, he's coming into the league with some wear and tear on his body, like Sam Bradford did with the shoulder injury that he had at Oklahoma. Wins the Rookie of the Year, so that would kind of automatically discount him from being a bust, but he never quite lived up to the hype of the highest graded quarterback that Todd McShay ever had. And in the right scenarios in Minnesota, I think in Philadelphia one year, of course, early with the Rams, he was just throwing darts all over the field. And you're like, you would finish a game and be like, man, like that was impressive. Then the next week for 3 straight weeks, he would have 180 yards at 5 yards per attempt with 3 picks. And you're like, how did that same quarterback do that? I could see Michael Penix in the right scenario being like great Sam Bradford, and then also like, oh, he can't really move and he takes too many hits and he's too aggressive as a thrower. So I went with Sam Bradford for Michael Penix.
Yeah, I mean, his career was so derailed by those injuries, and that could very well happen to Michael Penix as well. I mean, if he has those same problems at the NFL level, I don't know how to predict that, but if he does, it could ruin his career. So if you're saying what could take him down, certainly injuries could take him down. The only thing that I think is different about their style of play that would make him a different type of bust, and you really touched on this, was Bradford, his aggressiveness would, I think, wane. Like,
yeah, that's true.
In certain games, he would really trust his arm. And it would be like, whoa, he is just putting on a laser show. And then other games he would average, like you said, like 5 yards attempt. And it was just check down, check down. Like Kyle Rudolph put up an incredible season in 2016. And I know the line was bad, but it was just, it'd be 3rd and 7, like get 3 yards on a check down to Kyle Rudolph. And I remember looking at this, and I don't have the stat on the tip of my tongue, but it was something like on 3rd down, he targeted Rudolph 41 times and got like 10 first downs or something.
Oh my
just
Lord.
Like that.
That's
Bradford
not Michael Penix. You're right.
No, that's not Michael Penix. So I think that Penix's mentality, assuming in the NFL, is going to be, regardless of where he plays, very aggressive, very like self-belief and so forth. But as far as could the injuries take apart a guy with a monster arm who's a pocket quarterback, yeah, I think that's a really good comp. So our yearly tradition of draft comp busts, that's that. And of course, you had to go there. People are going to call for you to be banned from the show with the Christian Ponder. They're never going to allow you back in the room. So anyway, but I see your point. Chris Trapasso, great stuff, man. We'll talk again next week, and we will be a step closer to finding out what happens with the Minnesota Vikings. Maybe by then we will know if they're going to make this big trade up or not. We're recording a podcast, so we're trying to podcast it into existence, I guess. So thanks again, as always, for this epic episode, Chris, and we'll do it again very soon.
Football.